We gather this morning called forth by love to find joy and comfort in one another, to bear each other's burdens, and to celebrate the mystery of life. Come, let us worship together.
In this time of apparent disconnection and detachment, we light this chalice to remind ourselves that connections do exist. We value our spiritual connections to people all around the world, people who share our thirst for compassion, equity, and inclusion. Please join us in singing hymn 1031, Filled with Loving Kindness.
Imagine you came across a friend and you noticed they had something on their face. Because you are a good friend, you decided to tell them about it so they could fix it. But imagine that they responded, "How dare you tell me I have something on my face? You don't get to play with me anymore." Or, "Funny you should say that because you are the one who has something on your face." Or, "I have something on my face? What's wrong with me? I'm going back to bed." Or even, "Everyone has something on their face, so why even mention it? There's nothing we can do about it. It's always going to be this way." It probably wouldn't feel very good if your friend said one of those things to you. And none of those words actually gets the green splotch off their face. So what if they said instead, "I have something on my face? Thank you for telling me. I've been washing it away bit by bit, but I guess some of it is stickier than I thought. I really appreciate you letting me know. Will you help me wash it off?" I bet that response would actually make your friendship stronger, and it would get that green splotch off your friend's face.
The mission of Birmingham Unitarian Church is to be a free and welcoming religious community that encourages the lives of integrity, learning, service, and joy. One way we live out this mission is by giving half of our weekly offering to a nonprofit organization that shares our values and addresses needs in one of these areas: environmental action, income equality, civic engagement, and racial justice. We support a new organization every month. The November plate collection recipient is Welcome Inn. Welcome Inn is run by South Oakland Citizens for the Homeless and is the only daytime shelter for unhoused people in Oakland County. It is in full operation from December to March, providing guests with a warm place to spend the day, hot lunches, clothing, social services, and health visits. Welcome Inn is a low-barrier shelter. This means they accept everyone, often described as hospice for the homeless. Welcome Inn has sent a short video to tell us more about themselves. let there be an offering in support of our beloved community and organizations that build the world we dream about. This morning's offering will now be received with gratitude. Ushers, come forward. We are a church of open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands. With gratitude, we dedicate this offering to the good works of our congregation and dedicate ourselves to its service. Thank you.
Come to the time in our service that we set aside for prayer and centering and reflection. As we mark the beginning of Native American Heritage Month, we acknowledge that the campus of Birmingham Unitarian Church occupies ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. Bloomfield Hills is situated on land that was ceded in the 1807 Treaty of Detroit. We acknowledge Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, as well as historic Indigenous communities in Michigan. We also acknowledge Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. We have a sharing of joys and sorrows from our congregation. Mary Jo Larson and Jim Beiser share a joy with us. They say, "We have moved to Ann Arbor to be closer to our daughter, Liz Beiser, who has bought a home there with her husband, where they both have their dream jobs, and our son, Jordan, who is at graduate school at U of M." Paul Plant also shares a joy with us. BC members and friends again this year exceeded our donations request to feed guests at South Oakland Shelter for our host week. He is especially grateful to Karen Steinke and helpers for making Friday night dinner, as well as the BC staff. The Deering and Mangalkar families want to wish the beloved BC community a happy Diwali. May the inner light that resides in each of us shine with power and strength to overcome darkness and injustice in our world. Abha Deering would like to express gratitude and love to her mom, Latika Mangalkar, for making our family Diwali celebration delicious, beautiful, and meaningful. We also have a sharing of concerns and sorrows in our congregation. You know, I think I was remiss. I want to take a minute to go back. I think I offered a land acknowledgement that was pretty serious, and I don't think I gave that the time that it needed. I want to just offer up a space for us all to take a moment to sit with that and to sit with the complicated history of our nation. So let's start off with that. And the concerns that we have in our community today. Lori Palmer asks, "Please pray with me for my dearest friend, Terry G., for courage and hope in this coming week as she faces very painful and difficult cancer treatment." We also hear from the Zamborsky family, who is mourning the loss of Trevor's mom, who died last Wednesday after suffering brain damage from a stroke. Please keep Trevor, his siblings, her grandchildren, and all of the family that she is survived by in their hearts. Today, we also acknowledge the sacrifice and service of our military veterans. You have embodied the best of our nation's values: courage, service before self, loyalty, duty, honor. You have put our nation and your fellow Americans above your personal desires and your safety, and for that we are grateful as we long for the day where military action is a distant memory. I invite you now to move with me further into the spirit of prayer and centering. We call upon sources of strength and wisdom to join us in this time. We call upon those who have come before us, those who have loved us into being, whether they be family or inspirations, possibility models. During this time of year with so much busyness, so many remembrances and celebrations, let us also find a center of stillness. Let's find within ourselves that which is sacred and quiet and loving. During this time together, there are joys and sorrows that remain on our hearts that have been unspoken, and there are those that we have in our minds, those that we hold in our hearts. We take some time now to name aloud those that we bring with us into this space. May these beloved be held in love and in strength and in compassion. As we celebrate together, let us find strength and joy in one another and in this beautiful day that has been given to us. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.
During the events in our nation's capital last January 6th, the news source I was watching showed an interview with a woman who had been maced by Capitol Police as she entered the U.S. Capitol building. She was stunned because she thought being maced was not something that should happen to her. To her, an ordinary white American from Knoxville, Tennessee. In the interview, she expressed complete shock. The interviewer asked her why she wanted to go into the Capitol building. She replied, "We're storming the Capitol. It's a revolution." This month, we are talking about compassion, empathy, gratitude, and hope. But I began by thinking about when I do not have compassion. As I listened to this would-be revolutionary, I saw I did not have compassion for her. To quote someone on YouTube, "Have you ever felt so privileged that you thought it was rude of security to mace you while you tried to topple the government?" People have received worse from the police than mace for less. I have compassion for people who have been mistreated by police and other institutions. Lots of people have been mistreated. People who do not expect their privilege or lack of privilege to protect them, who are trying to make this country a more inclusive, just, and equitable place to live for everyone. The woman storming the Capitol, of course, was not alone. She was not alone that day or on any other. Making what I believe is a small leap, I suspect many of the people who were storming the Capitol that day are the same people who complain about Confederate monuments being removed, corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and multiracial families in television commercials. I know some of these people, and they are fairly explicit in their desire to turn the clock back. Although being a religious liberal does not necessarily mean being politically liberal, it is hard to reconcile our UU principles of justice, equity, compassion, and the use of the democratic process with a set of beliefs that deny to others the privileges some have always enjoyed, prefer to continue their privilege rather than develop ways to create equity, and use force to keep an administration sympathetic to white privilege and white supremacy in power. It is important to have compassion, but it should be reserved for those who need and deserve it, not for those who are denying it to others to keep their own advantages in place.
This morning's second reading is by Marjorie Bowens-Wheatley. It is titled, "Why Should We Intentionally Work for Diversity?" Why should we intentionally work for diversity? The responses vary widely. Of course, hard demographic realities suggest as much, but for me, beyond any demographic or sociological justification, there is the theological imperative. Affirming the inherent worth and dignity of every human, for me, means working to create places of worship where all who subscribe to a liberal approach to religion can not only feel welcome, but enter into worship settings that reflect the diverse cultural realities of we the people. Congregations that reflect the pluralism of our society are one step in beginning to transcend the social boundaries that divide us from each other and from all that is, which some of us call God. The task ahead is an arduous one. Indeed, diversity is one of the most challenging tasks we will undertake as a religious movement. What we are dealing with is not simply racial and ethnic diversity, but a paradigm shift that is rooted in commitment to growth in a pluralistic community, as well as readiness for and acceptance of cultural change within our congregations. Each month during this worship year, we'll explore one of our Unitarian Universalist principles. As UUs, we are not beholden to a particular doctrine or creed. What holds us together is not mutual belief, but mutual concern. We are a covenantal religious tradition, which means that we make promises to each other about how we will behave. Our covenants give us boundaries that we need to freely explore theology, spirituality, values, and other tools that we might need to contemplate life's big questions. We know ourselves as Unitarian Universalists by the covenants that we keep. Our UU principles are an overarching covenant made between congregations and people who are part of the Unitarian Universalist Association, including us. And I would hazard a guess that many of you here looked up Unitarian Universalism on the internet, found these 7 principles, and said, yeah, that sounds good. That's how a lot of us get here. And then we realize, oh, what that means in terms of being a covenant. We also have a congregational covenant that further clarifies the aspirations of this specific congregation, and this is not easy to make these lofty promises about how we're going to behave. It's all fun and games until somebody irritates you. There are currently 7 UU principles, and we have a movement underway to adopt an 8th principle that is explicitly anti-racist and anti-oppressive, which is a movement that I fully support. And you might be interested to know, or you might already know, that our high school youth group adopted the 8th principle last year. In fact, they've set up some material in Hodis Hall to talk with you after the service about why they adopted it and how it's going. I think we have some people with us today that's who you can go talk to. You? Yeah, okay. Today and throughout the month of November, we are focusing on the second principle. The first principle last month, second principle this month. The statement of the Unitarian Universalist principles begins, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, do covenant to affirm and promote," and then the second principle is justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And there are some who would argue that the 8th principle is unnecessary because the second principle does similar work. But if our second principle was doing enough, there would not be a movement underway by UUs of color and other UUs who hold other marginalized identity asking for another, more explicit, anti-racist and anti-oppressive principle. And that request has been to add an 8th principle rather than rewrite the second principle or any other principle, because there is a continued need for those original principles. Our world will always be in need of that second principle, will always be in need of justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And I want to be clear that when I say compassion, I do not mean being nice. Compassion, the word compassion literally means to suffer together. We covenant and affirm to promote justice, equity, and compassion, or affirm to promote justice, equity, and sharing in the suffering of those who suffer. If we are to share in the suffering of those who suffer, there are a few prerequisites. Well, first, we have to understand who is suffering. Any of us can feel pain, discomfort, sadness, but that doesn't really rise to the level of suffering. As that old hymn goes, this old world is full of sorrow, full of sickness, weak and sore. And it is our goal as a church, the goal of, I would think, every church, to share each other's sorrows and challenges. We are meant to care for each other on a daily basis. But again, if something needs to be spelled out in an association-wide covenant, it is something above and beyond the implicit functionings of a religious community. We wouldn't write it down if we were already doing it, right? So we need our second principle because it calls us to go beyond comforting one another in everyday difficulties and infirmities. Our second principle places compassion alongside justice and equity. Now, why is that? I think it's because we're being asked to consider who does not have access to justice and equity, and that is to whom our compassion should be intentionally directed. Our second principle asks us to consider those at the margins of power and to share in that suffering. The way that we talk about and that we think about power and oppression in our congregations is nothing short of an existential crisis for the Unitarian Universalist Association. And I mean that both in a question of who are we as a liberal religious tradition, as well as will we continue to exist? There's a shift underway, and it causes a lot of feelings. And the differences in how we approach the subject of power and oppression are often framed as a generational divide or an identity-based divide. That analysis is reductive, and it is a distraction from the work at hand. If we stay focused on power and oppression as a political issue or as an academic concern, then we have missed the point, because we are not a political organization or an academic institution, despite a little bit of evidence to the contrary. Unitarian Universalism is a religion. Not only that, we are a liberal religion, and like Bill said, that does not mean politically liberal. Many of us happen to be politically liberal, but that is not a foregone conclusion. It is rather the result of increasingly divided and strenuous political rhetoric. We are not inherently politically liberal. We are a part of a church, an association of churches, that applies liberalism to religion. Liberal religion is grounded in the belief that religion is a dynamic as opposed to static force. To be liberally religious is to believe that religion is a living, breathing thing that changes over time and has no permanent form of expression. We do not have a creed or a doctrine because we reject their constraints on religious experience and expression. And yet, we do religion together. We build our theology and our spiritual practices within the context of community, which means that we have to place constraints on ourselves, if not our beliefs, thus covenants. If my religious exploration constrains your religious exploration, then I have done the very thing that we set out to avoid by refusing to accept doctrine and creed. We have reinvented a wheel that we tried to get away from. Our mutual agreement is to support each other in our religious explorations without interfering. And there's an important tension between those two. We can't find the balance between supporting and interfering if we don't understand how systems of power and oppression operate in human relations. In other words, we have to understand who does and does not have access to justice and equity so that we don't crowd them out of religious community. If we are unaware of how we enact power and oppression on others, however unintentionally, then we have forfeited the process of building diverse religious community. We have lost the valuable perspectives that challenge and push us beyond our own theological conclusions. When we limit our religious community to others who are like us, again, however unintentionally, we cause religion to become static. We cast Unitarian Universalism in our own likeness, and we lose what it is to be a liberal religion. Affirming justice, equity, and compassion in human relations is not a passive statement of, yes, yes, I agree, this should be true, I also share this value. The principles of the Unitarian Universalist Association are not a statement of values, they are a covenant. And covenants are aspirational and behavioral agreements. As you use, our religious understanding prioritizes the primacy of human relationships. It is through our relationships that we are changed, that we change the world around us. If we don't understand how our behavior impacts others, or if we flat out refuse to acknowledge that our behavior impacts others, then we are incapable of living into our second principle. Moreover, if we are ignorant to the parts of our social identity that grant us unearned privilege, such as being white or young, but not too young, and straight or cisgender, or not disabled, or English speaking, or an American citizen, or a man, if we don't understand how those parts of our identity fit into systems of power and oppression, then we unwittingly become tools of oppression, even if you don't mean to. The second principle calls us to a life of justice, equity, and compassion. We are incapable of having compassion if we don't understand who is suffering and how and why and the role that we might play in causing that suffering, even if we don't mean to. Calibrating our behavior, choosing behavioral constraints that allow others to flourish, that is how we live into our covenants. What we're after as a liberal religion is a different way of living. Our church is a laboratory for building the beloved community, the world that we dream about. We're here for transformation, and we can't expect to be changed by living here the way we're taught out there. And for those of you on Zoom, I am speaking metaphorically, not the building. Our second principle is a call to reflection and a call to action. Truly living into the second principle requires a willingness to learn. And you yous are really good at that. Man, do we love a workshop or a book read? Learning is important, but it's safe. And it's just the starting point of a journey. That knowledge has to make its way down out of the head and into the heart. The second principle requires us to feel. Specifically, it requires us to feel compassion. It requires us to suffer with, to give up some comfort and suffer with. We're not a political organization. We are not an intellectual society. We are a church. We are here for an encounter with something that is beyond our individual experience, something that is always changing, we believe, something that is always moving us further into the mysteries of human existence. We are here to witness and to be changed by the mysteries of life. We might start by learning something, but then we have to feel something because of what we learned. And then we have to do something. We are a liberal religion. We believe that religion does something in the world, that it is a dynamic, ever-changing force that adapts and compels us. Unitarian Universalism, beloved, is not a thought experiment. If what we're doing here doesn't do anything out of here, then we have failed. We don't do in here what we do out there, but we do out there what we do in here. Again, metaphor. Liberal religion is costly. It is risky. It is demanding. It requires nothing short of everything that we are and a willingness for that to change over time. And this second principle and its demand that we suffer with others does not come cheap. At the very least, it requires vulnerability and a willingness to be uncomfortable. When someone tells us that there's a green splotch on our face, it can be embarrassing. But if we ever hope to do anything about that splotch, we have to start by knowing that it's there, by being willing to hear that it's there. And then we have to believe that we can do something about that splotch, that it's not just the way it is, but we can actually do something about it. And we have to be willing to get it wrong as we try to do something about it, in faith that eventually we will do it less wrong. We have to be willing to take that risk because it is worth the reward. Unexamined power and oppression, especially and most intensely racism, and I would also say ableism, is a splotch on the face of Unitarian Universalism. We didn't mean to do it, but it's true. And this is the existential crisis part. We are at risk of losing our relevance in American society, perhaps More importantly, we are at risk of losing ourselves and who we are. If we are content to accept yesterday's Unitarian Universalism without the risk and the reward of changing, of adapting to a new understanding of the world, of what it means to be a human being living in this moment, are we still a liberal religion? If we are content to think that we have somehow achieved Unitarian Universalism by turning it into a rigid set system of practices that keep us safe and comfortable, are we following the brave and dangerous path that our spiritual forebears created for us? No. They did not bushwhack into uncharted territory so that we could become complacent and think that we figured it out. That's not the legacy that we've been handed. We're supposed to keep going. We believe that religion changes and pushes us further into the human experience, and we know that the human experience changes. And so must we, as individuals, as a church, as an association. Our principles are a seeming paradox of voluntary limitations that allow us to have greater expansion. When we pay attention to the dynamics of who has access to justice and equity, and then we put ourselves in solidarity with those who suffer, we have compassion, we grow. We bring our world a little closer to being the world that we dream about. And I'll close with a poem from the Reverend Teresa Soto. To be free, you embrace the breadth of your own existence without apology, even when they try to take it from you. And you must know, not that you can do whatever you want. You are not a kudzu vine eating entire hillsides for the purpose of feeding your own lush life. You must know, instead, that inside you are entire universes, milky blue, magenta, and gold, expanding. But to actually be free, you must know and you must fight for the entire universes inside of everyone else. Being free is not a license, it is a promise. May it be so. Go now into this world as a beacon of hope and joy. Go now in love, go now in peace. Now that our worship has ended, our service begins. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.